Falcons defense looked to change the perception with a disruptive day 2 of joint practices versus the Miami Dolphins.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. We're helping you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So if you don't know me, guys, I'm your very humble hater host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast, and I think each every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers, that means you make this podcast your first listen or first watch each and every day. And if you want to become an everydayer, all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today's episode, we are recapping day 2 of the Falcons Dolphins joint practices down in Miami Gardens, Florida. We'll talk later on the episode about the impact of Rondale Moore's potentially season-ending injury. But I want to start today's episode talking about today's second joint practice against Miami. Later in the episode, we'll talk about sort of our big takeaways from the entire time in Miami and what it tells us about the defense. But since we don't have a guest to sort of give us a firsthand account on today's episode, we're going to rely heavily on, our favorite, not favorite website, X.com, aka Twitter, and the tweets will kind of tell the story. Now, yesterday we had Daniel Flick of Fan Nation on, for a brief time yesterday due to technical difficulties to give his firsthand account, having been down at practice. And he basically said the Falcons kind of started out slow and then finished strong. And it sounds like today, based off of the tweets, and we'll hear from Daniel in some of these tweets, that the Falcons started much better today. And our first tweet comes from Travis Wingfield, former Locked On Dolphins host, now works for MiamiDolphins.com. And he said, Falcons defense came to play in this opening red zone period. Some big hits, disciplined in their fits, giving minimal ground. They had a sack and 2 tackles for short or no gain in the run game. Tua did have a scramble throw to Craycraft on the move that was pretty. And Jonnu Smith, that is, just scored on a now throw. Then Chris Perkins from the Sun Sentinel tweeted at Tua's incompletion, wisely throws it away as at A-Chain's feet while under pressure. Falcons pass rush having good success early in this 11-on-11. And our friend, our resident minor beat writer, Tyler DeCina, who's 12 years old, from Finn's Focus, adds, the Falcons defense definitely getting the win early on, pressuring Tua, blowing up runs and screens, disrupting timing. So overall, this paints a picture. We have 3 Dolphins people praising the Falcons defense, stepping up, applying some of that pressure. And yesterday, we touched upon the idea that maybe Lorenzo Carter was sort of the standout pass rusher, at least among the edge group for the Falcons. And maybe today was Arnold Ebiketie's day to be this sort of standout, because this one comes from our guy, Daniel Flick of Fan Nation. He says, Falcons defense has generated some pressure on Tua today. Arnold Ebiketie has been really, really active. And that paints a very positive portrait of the Falcons offense being disruptive, which we'll talk more about. But we also have Joe Shad of the Palm Beach Post talking a little bit more about the Falcons defense and the Dolphins offensive struggles. Aside from a few big plays, the Dolphins offense has not been sharp at all today versus the Falcons. Now, when he's talking about the big plays from the tweets I saw, it was Dolphins 6th-round wide receiver Malik Washington rather than Falcons 6th-round rookie wide receiver Casey Washington, or, free agent pickup wide receiver James Washington. That if there's a battle of the Washingtons, at least at the wide receiver position, because apparently Carlos Washington at the running back position continues to look good. But if there's a battle of the Washingtons, it seems like based off of these 2 days of practice, Malik Washington is sort of, the winner of the Washington Monument, so to speak, as he was the recipient on a couple of those big plays. But it's nice to hear that, besides a couple of big plays, we had that big one to Tyreek Hill yesterday in that first day of joint practices. But it does seem like the Falcons are going to keep things in check. Again, we'll revisit this topic in terms of what it all means for this defense and their outlook heading into the regular season towards the end of today's episode. But clearly the Falcons defense was trying to establish a tone, right? And they were seemingly successful at doing that. And that sort of tone setting, I think, led to, practice being a little chippier, being a little testier, both sides, both the Falcons offense and Falcons defense, as well as, Miami in different phases. There was a lot of skirmishes, a lot of fights and whatnot. And this also comes from Daniel Flick. Another Falcons versus Dolphins fight. Ray McCloud threw a punch after being knocked to the turf. Another all offense versus all defense scrum. Long meeting between the two teams before breaking to their respective sidelines. So this is Daniel noting what was like the last of like 3 or 4 fights, depending on your count. We'll get the official, scorecard from D-Led, of the AJC. He loves to score these bouts and these skirmishes and whatnot in his write-up. But it seemed like a lot of them from the Falcons standpoint wasn't necessarily the Falcons defense going up against the Dolphins offense and starting some fights. It was the Falcons offense, maybe being a little dejected that they weren't maybe as fluid as they needed to be, because it was Ray McCloud, as Daniel mentioned. John Fitzpatrick, I understand, was involved in one. Tyler Algier was involved in another one. So, things got a little testy, maybe the heat and humidity, but things eventually sort of cooled down. But the concern, if you're the Falcons, is like there may be a fine in the future for this, right? We saw this week the Lions and Giants both get fined by the NFL because of several fights at their joint practices, and I think it was like $200,000 each for those teams. And we'll see if the NFL decides, like, hey guys, like, we love that you're doing these joint practices, but you got to keep it cordial in these things. So we'll see about that. But I think part of the reason why the NFL brought the hammer down on those teams is because there was video of those fights, and didn't see a whole lot of video from the Dolphins practice. So they probably won't be as punished as harshly, but we'll see on that front. But, we're talking about the Falcons defense. Let's talk a little bit more about the Falcons offense, even though, maybe wasn't the best day for the Falcons offense. Marcel Louis-Jacques from ESPN touted both Kyle Pitts and Bijan Robinson, tweeting, Kyle Pitts is causing matchup issues. He looked healthy. He looks healthy again. He and Bijan Robinson have stood out for the Falcons today. And so, Bijan being Bijan, that's just, as we joked a lot last year, there's 2 people in the world that, there's Bijan fans and people that haven't watched him play football yet. And so clearly, Bijan is converting some of the Dolphins beat writers and whatnot. And then with Kyle Pitts, it just kind of piggybacks on a point we made, I think, earlier this week, talking about his potential to create mismatches on offense. And so it's nice to see that translating into practice. Now, on the injury front, before we get to Rondale Moore, we did get Braylon Trice returning from practice after he missed Tuesday's joint practice with an illness. We did not get Ryan Nielsen on the second day. He was dealing with a calf strain. And, it led to Javon Gwynn taking those second team center snaps in replace of him. And it seemed like it led to the second team offense sort of struggling up front a little bit. Daniel Flick tweeted, Falcons backup offensive line hasn't been as effective in run blocking today. Important to note, Atlanta is playing without Ryan Nuzul, who's been the second team center in camp. And that led to some issues with, I think Michael Penix and whatnot. Daniel Flick had another tweet saying, no one-on-ones today. Joint practice started with red zone. Kirk Cousins hit his first 2 and only passes in the red zone. Falcons had a lot of success running right with Tyler Algier. Both of Miami's second teams beat Atlanta's second teams. No touchdown for Michael Penix Jr. and company. So the Falcons second team offense didn't have quite the success on day 2 as they may have had on day 1 by all accounts. But I think overall the takeaways, looking at all these various tweets, is it's nice to sort of see the defense step up. We'll talk more about that later in the episode. But it seems like they're having a little bit more sense of urgency today and getting off to that better start on day 2 of these joint practice. And it goes back to something that Kirk Cousins talked about earlier in training camp and has talked about a bunch in training camp about perception versus reality, referring to the sort of perception outside the locker room that the Falcons, specifically talking about the Falcons offense, going to be good this year, but it's up to the players inside that locker room to put the time, the effort, the energy, the work, all that stuff to make that a reality. And obviously that's Kirk talking specifically about the offense, but today it's kind of reflecting on the team as a whole, or the defense specifically. And, that's, many of you guys sort of perceive this as negativity or pessimism, but for me, that's kind of where my sort of sense of urgency comes from with this football team. That, like, after 6 years of the Falcons not making the playoffs, I'm tired of people just telling me, oh, like, this is our year. It's like, show me that you're a playoff team. Don't tell me that you're a playoff team. All this telling is just nonsense to me. And every time I log on to Twitter, we won't go on a rant, but like, I see all these blue check accounts sitting here scamming people by, blowing smoke up their butt, telling them that this is going to be our year. And I'm just like, all right, guys. But, I think overall the Falcons coming out of day 2 of practice, showing a little bit more of that urgency is what I'm talking about, is the showing me part of it. And we'll talk about some of these big takeaways from these 2 days of joint practices later. But, it makes me feel like, there's a little bit more buy-in at this point in time, right? And I think this is a positive step in the right direction. This is the second time we've seen the defense specifically take positive steps, right? Going back to last week on day 2 of pads, where we talked about the defense stepping up after a lackluster day 1 and whatnot, or not necessarily a day 1, but you know what I'm saying, like getting better, as the week wears on, and sort of seeing that thing follow suit for this defense. And maybe that's something, that sort of resiliency, that ability to respond to adversity, is something that, makes us optimistic about the future of this defense this upcoming season. More on that later. But it wasn't always positive for the Falcons on day 2 of these joint practices. Rondale Moore went down with what could be a season-ending injury. We'll talk about what that means for the player as well as the team coming up on today's Locked On Falcons. Now, in the NFL, training camp and preseason is all about finding the right quality professionals that are going to fit your team. And it's true for your small business, finding those right people. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs is there for you, instead of, sweating it out in that Florida or Georgia heat. And they have the tools that are going to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just any old job board, because they're going to help you find the professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a job, but just might be open for the perfect role. In any given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. And on LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So before we get into the Rondale Moore injury discussion, there's a question out there. Is Drake London as good a fantasy buy? Is he a risky fantasy pickup? Well, get the insight by checking out Locked On Fantasy Football as your second listen to hear what they have to say about it. Locked On Fantasy Football, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So on Rondale Moore, right? Practice ended about a half hour early due to an injury to Rondale Moore. He went down with a non-contact injury to his lower right leg, possibly knee. He was carted off with an air cast and transported to a local hospital. Air cast, based off of my 15-year-old EMT training, air cast is usually applied when there's a potential bone break. And so we'll see if we get an update later tonight or tomorrow, as I'm recording this around 5 p.m. Eastern time. But this doesn't sound good, right? And it's not necessarily based off him being carted off. We know that typically this time of year, teams tend to be extra cautious with any types of leg injuries, and they'll cart a player off, and it may wind up not being nothing. But the fact that this was a non-contact injury, the fact that there's an air cast involved, it's hard to be optimistic that this isn't going to be a serious injury. I'm not going to speculate on it, but I am going to assume the worst and believe that this is probably a season ender for Rondale Moore. But obviously, we're going to hope for a better outcome for that. But, if it is a season ender, it's devastating to the player, not so much for the team, right? And that may sound harsh, but we've been talking, since training camp began about, the competition for that slot receiver spot, and how as time wears on, there seems to have been a increasing gap between Rondale Moore and Ray McCloud for that number 3 spot, right? With McCloud being counted on as a starter and Moore not. And because of that potentially pushes Moore to being more on the roster bubble. Now, it was unlikely, I think, that Moore would wind up getting cut by this team. But right now, he's essentially the number 6 wide receiver on the depth chart, right? That's due to the fact that he's probably not going to be a major contributor on special teams. And that's going to lead to him being inactive, even if he does make the Falcons, pre-injury, obviously, make the Falcons roster. He would likely be inactive as that 6 wide receiver because you're going to keep 4 or 5 wide receivers active on game day. And those 4th and 5th wide receivers, in this case, if McLeod's the number 3, Kadero Hodge and Casey Washington would presumably be 4 and 5. McLeod and Hodge obviously have special teams value. Casey Washington, we talked about that when we drafted him in our breakdown back at the beginning of July, that he's probably going to get a long look on special teams this summer. And so it's going to be a high probability that Moore would be inactive on game days, even if he made the roster again. Hashtag special teams matter. But, when we look at the 48 active players each week on an NFL roster, about 35, 36, depending on the team, your math and whatnot, are going to play offensive defense. The remaining 12 to 13 players are there primarily to play special teams, right? They might dabble a couple of snaps here or there when someone needs a breather on offensive defense, but primarily they're playing special teams. And for wide receivers, it's really only the top 3 guys that are guaranteed to be counted as that top 35 or 36. Right. And then for the 4th and 5th wide receivers that typically are active for most NFL teams, their limited snaps on offense usually is when one of those top 3 guys needs a breather. And a significant percentage of those plays wind up being run plays when teams don't have those guys on the field. And so those guys are asked to block. And when you look at Moore, who's 180 pounds, versus Hodge and Washington, who are 200 plus pounds, you can guess who's probably going to get a lot more of those blocking snaps than other people are. And I think, we probably may talk about later. I plan on doing a write-up on Ray McLeod over at the Falcoholic later this week, so I'll save some of my thoughts on it. But I think a big reason why Ray McLeod has seemingly leapfrogged Rondale Moore in the number 3 battle is because Ray McLeod is probably a more effective run blocker than Rondale Moore is at this point in time, dating from his time in San Francisco, where basically all your wide receivers, and this goes back to Kyle Shanahan's days here in Atlanta, where it's like, I want all guys that can block, right? That can get after it in the run game. And so I think that's a big reason why Ray McLeod has seemingly climbed up the depth chart in that regard. But, outside a couple of design gadget plays for Rondale Moore, basically what I'm saying is I don't think losing your number 6 wide receiver is going to be a big deal for the team, especially since a lot of those gadget plays can go to Ray McLeod or Avery Williams or whoever else who have, similar skill sets to Rondale Moore. But, this is why it's devastating to the player because, there were going to be opportunities for Rondale Moore to kind of rewrite the narrative over the next couple of weeks, right? And we talked a little bit about Michael Penix, right, over the last week and how he's going to get the majority of the work in the preseason over these next 3 games. And Moore could benefit from that because it seems like he and Casey Washington have been Michael Penix's favorite targets working with that second string offense in these various training camp battles. And so that gave Moore an opportunity that if he had a really strong summer, if he just kind of balled out in these preseason games, that that wide receiver 3 battle between him and McLeod would be much more of a serious competition, in 3 weeks from now than what it has been over these last 2+ weeks. Now it still was probably going to be an uphill battle for Rondale Moore, but it was at least doable. Like you can imagine a scenario where he's going out there and doing that, and that scenario kind of fizzles away now that he's injured, right? And this is going to potentially derail the remainder of whatever is left of Rondale Moore's career, because this year is a contract year for him, which means he's going to be a free agent next year. And this time in Atlanta was going to be, his last best shot at carving out a significant role in the NFL, right? Because Moore is essentially a reclamation project for the Falcons, right? His high draft status, 2nd round pick for the Cardinals, merited him getting opportunities in Arizona that he didn't always quite back up in terms of his production on the field. But now that he's left Arizona, no other team is going to have that level of vested interest in trying to make him work, right? Because they didn't invest a 2nd round pick. The Falcons basically gave him away for the price of Desmond Ridder, right? Who probably his trade market at the time we traded him was a conditional 7th round pick. So that's essentially how you had to think about the Falcons acquiring. They gave up a conditional 7th round pick for Rondale Moore. And, because of that, like he's no longer going to get the benefit of the doubt that he got in Arizona, not here in Atlanta or elsewhere in the future. But, he could have, again, rewritten that narrative if he had a good year in Atlanta, right? And that would thus allow him to have some momentum going into free agency to be like, okay, this other team's like, hey, we saw what he did in Atlanta. Let's make him our number 3 wide receiver or something like that. But now that he's potentially going to miss the season, it's going to be very hard for him to earn those opportunities in the future. And you kind of see that reflected with James Washington, one of the Falcons' most recent wide receiver pickups, right? He's a great example of this. He was a second-round pick by the Steelers, like Moore, back in 2018. He played out his rookie contract in Pittsburgh. They had a vested interest in him succeeding. He didn't succeed in Pittsburgh. And he's really struggled to make an NFL roster the last 2 years. He's been on 4 different teams over the last 2 years. The Falcons are the 5th team that he's been on since leaving Pittsburgh in 2021, after the 2021 season. And so, like, similarly, I think this is a potential setback that's going to make it hard for Moore to bounce back from, and stick on NFL rosters moving forward. And so if this does wind up being a season ender for Rondale Moore, I think it basically ruins his last good shot at being his last good shot, not his last shot, but his last good shot is basically what I'm saying, from being an impact wide receiver in the NFL. And, I think maybe there's some potential that he can reinvent himself maybe as a running back coming back from this injury. But I think moving to running back also presents its unique set of challenges because we just know there aren't that many sub 190 pound running backs that have succeeded in the NFL. It's Wark Dunn and Darren Sproles, and that's about it, right? We'll see if Keaton Mitchell and Deuce Vaughn can sort of rewrite that narrative as well in the future, between now and when Rondale Moore comes back. But, I do expect Rondale to come back. By all accounts, he's an A+ character, work ethic, all those various things. Even if his season is over, 100% believe he's going to work his tail off to get back from this injury, but it is going to be harder for him. And we'll just hope for his sake that, we get some good news in the next, 12 to 24 hours on the injury front for him, but it's unfortunate for him, but I don't think it's going to really move the needle for the Falcons. But, of course, this is the golden opportunity where I feel like contractually obligated, where if the Falcons were to go out there and try to find a slot receiver that could theoretically push Ray McClellan, Hunter Renfrow does exist, but we won't get into that on today's episode. But we'll leave that aside and we'll talk more about sort of the big takeaway from these 2 days of joint practices, where our friend Joe Patrick of 92.9 The Game put out a tweet earlier today on Wednesday suggesting that, hey, the defense is looking good based off of what they were able to do against the Dolphins. And we'll push back a little bit against that. But at the same time, I think Joe is onto something where there is a little bit more hope for this Falcons defense. We'll get into that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, since you're not going to be able to make it down to Falcons practices, you're going to have some time to kill these afternoons. Why not make it back to the baseball stadium and check out the Braves on this stretch run with Game Time? They're taking the guesswork out of buying tickets. They're an authorized ticket marketplace for Major League Baseball. There you can shop flash deals where you can save on exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game. And Game Time has great features like you don't have to worry about hidden fees at checkout. You get the seat views, that panoramic view from your seat, so you can pick out the perfect spot to catch a fly ball. So whether you're into baseball, other sports, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you, Game Time is taking the guesswork out of buying tickets. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So we got one more tweet of the day, and this one comes from our guy Joe Patrick of 92.9 The Game. He writes, I am not in Miami Gardens just reading the tweets, but the fact that this Falcons defense is not getting torched by the Dolphins, and to the contrary is actually looking relatively disruptive and stout up front, that's the best outcome of this trip. We know this offense has relatively high floor. If the defense can hold their own against offenses like Miami, that's a recipe for success. So I think Joe is onto something here, but I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment. I got to, guys. They don't call me Mr. Drew for nothing, right? But, Miami is without 3 key starters on their offense, right? In terms of these practices, right? Jalen Waddle, Odell Beckham, and Isaiah Wynn did not practice in either of these 2 practices. That's their number 2 wide receiver, their number 3 wide receiver, and of course, their top interior offensive lineman. And if you did the same thing with the Falcons, let's say you took away Kyle Pitts, you took away Darnell Mooney, you took away Chris Lindstrom, you probably wouldn't put as much stock in an opposing defense being disruptive against them because you don't think this offense is at full strength. And the Falcons, as we noted earlier, did give up a couple of big plays over the course of these 2 days, and that's what Miami's offense kind of thrives on. And if you've listened to this podcast for any amount of time, you know that we are big believers that explosive plays are kind of everything when it comes to offense. And so you didn't really stop Miami from doing the thing that they want to do, which is generate those explosive plays. Now, again, some of that second string stuff. So it's hard to kind of parse out there. So we're not going to necessarily be like, oh no, the Falcons defense is still bad because they gave them a couple of explosive plays. But, for those of you that are unfamiliar with this podcast, you're newcomers to the podcast, welcome. But, we've been tracking data here, formerly at FalconsFans.com, RIP, and on this podcast for, over a decade, going back to 2010 with the Falcons, and the difference between outcomes that you have on drives that include a 20-plus yard play, an explosive play, and drives that don't, right? On a drive that includes a 20-plus yard play, the Falcons average 3.5 times more points per drive than on drives without one. They're 2.7 times more likely to reach the red zone on a drive with an explosive play than they are on a drive without one. 2.9 times more likely to score points on a drive with an explosive play than a drive without one. And 4.4 times more likely to score a touchdown on a drive that includes an explosive play. And so simply put, basically, the name of the game in the NFL, in the modern NFL, is putting points on the board. And a big play is basically going to make your offense 3 to 4 times better at putting those points on the board, however you slice it, is basically what it is. And so, that's the Falcons numbers. I imagine the Dolphins aren't too dissimilar. I'm not going to take the time to go through their play-by-play data over the last couple of years, but, I don't think glossing over, basically the point of that is, I don't think you shouldn't gloss over the idea that a couple of big plays, because a couple of big plays are kind of everything when it comes to offense, is basically the point I'm going to say. But that's the devil's advocate argument. On the flip side, I do agree with Joe that there are generally positives that you should take away from these 2 days of practice, especially when it comes to the defense, right? That despite all the speed and talent that the Dolphins have at the skill position players, and again, they weren't at 100% capacity in these practices, the one weakness that you do have in Miami's offense is their interior offensive line, right? With Wynn out, and their starting center, Aaron Brew, also got hurt early in practice today. So that's probably a contributing factor. But there are other starters on the interior offensive line, whether it's Robert Jones or Liam Eichenberg, are basically replacement level starters. And that's the biggest weakness of the Miami Dolphins offense. The biggest strength of the Falcons defense is their interior defensive line, right? And so when you hear that the Falcons interior defensive line is taking advantage of the Dolphins' biggest weakness, our biggest strength is taking advantage of their biggest weakness, that's a promising sign, right? And it gives you hope for future matchups, because later in the season, we're going to face some other teams that have very gifted skill position players, very good tackles, right? But may have some question marks on the interior offensive line, like Philadelphia, like Tampa Bay, and the Falcons being able to potentially exploit that weakness may be a big part of their ability to win those games in those matchups against Philadelphia and Tampa Bay early in the season. And I'm talking about that fast start that the Falcons kind of need. And so that's why, we talk a lot about outcomes or matchups in these games, and outcomes in NFL games are really based off of matchups, right? It's about, negating an opposing team's strengths while exploiting their weaknesses and hoping that the opposing team doesn't do that to you. And it's a very promising sign that the Falcons are seemingly exploiting the Dolphins' major weakness. That gives you hope for this defense. And, talking about the interior defensive line, we've talked a lot about the young guys. We talked about that earlier in the week. Taquan Graham, Zach Harrison, Rugeroro, Brandon Dorless, and how important it is those guys to step up, not because they're going to be the guys that are dominating these matchups and whatnot in these regular season games, but those guys are being productive and getting snaps is going to lead to Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata being fresher, right? And we've talked all off season long, right? That the anchor of your pass rush is going to be your interior. It's going to be Grady and David Onyemata. And those are going to be the guys that you're going to need to take over those games, to go out there and dominate a Mekhi Becton or a Cam Jurgens or a Tyler Steen in that Eagles game, to go out there and beat up on a rookie Graham Barton and, Cody Mock in that Bucs game and in other games and whatnot. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be definitely looking for over the course of the summer with these young guys emerging and whatnot. And, we're hoping, they can do that on Friday, more on that in a bit. But, again, I think it's a very promising sign that the Falcons are exploiting the Dolphins' weakness. Again, I don't know if the Falcons did enough to negate the Dolphins' strength, which is that explosiveness. And we haven't really talked about it on this podcast. But one of the concerns that you do have about the Falcons defense, given how many young, unproven players they have on that side of the ball, is that they may be more prone to giving up some of those big plays because of mental errors that come with playing unproven players. So I think Joe's point really is, not to put words in his mouth, but my interpretation of this tweet is, the big question with the Falcons that we've been talking all off season long is not that this defense is going to be good, but can they be good enough, right? Coupled with a high performing offense, can they be good enough to win games? And I think, the answer to that question always have been kind of maybe, and it's, for me, it's been a skeptical maybe. I know for others, it's maybe less skeptical, but I do think after these 2 days of practice, it's like maybe is kind of the tone that we're taking with it. So I do think there's reasons to be more optimistic about at least the strength of this defense in terms of the interior D line. We'll see if the edge room comes along. We'll see all that and whatnot, but there's opportunities for this defense to build more confidence over the next 3 weeks, especially if some of these young players elsewhere, we kind of know what we have in some of the veteran guys on the defense side of the ball, but what do we have in the young players? And that's going to be something that we're going to key in on in these upcoming preseason games. So overall, I think it's a very promising and productive week for the Falcons. And hopefully we'll see if they can finish that strong on Friday night against the Dolphins, and tomorrow between now and then, we should be back with Jarvis Davis to talk all about it, including what our expectations for Michael Penix are going to be in his debut NFL game and whatnot. So that's in store for you as your first listen here on Locked On Falcons tomorrow. Make sure you subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Football, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.